Marcus Voss pointed at her and laughed first. Not a quiet, polite laugh that rich people use when they want to seem restrained. A full, open-mouthed laugh, the kind designed to carry across a room, to pull heads around, to make everyone else feel like they had permission to join in. Elena Marlowe stood in the doorway of the Harrington Grand Ballroom, her green dress pressed and simple, her hands steady, even though her chest had stopped working correctly, the moment 60 pairs of eyes turned toward her. "My God," Marcus said, loud enough for the chandelier to hear. "Is that what you're wearing?" The room didn't go silent. It went worse than silent, it rippled. And just when Elena thought she had reached the lowest point a person could reach, inside a single evening, the doors behind her opened again. And everything changed. If this kind of story speaks to something you've felt, that moment when the room turns against you, and no one moves, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling us the city or country where you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The invitation had come 3 weeks earlier, slipped under Elena's apartment door with no note attached, just the gold-embossed cardstock that announced the engagement dinner for Marcus Voss and Celeste Harrington, black tie preferred, Saturday evening at 7. Elena had stood there in the hallway for a long time holding it, turning it over in her hands, trying to figure out what she was supposed to feel. Marcus was her past. 2 years of her life. 2 years she had spent believing in a version of the future that turned out to be something only she had imagined. She had been 26 when they met, working a paralegal position during the day, and sitting sick, law school night classes until 10 o'clock, falling asleep on the bus home with her textbooks in her lap. Marcus had been funny then. He had been warm in the particular way that some people are warm when they want something from you, and she hadn't yet learned the difference. She didn't hate him, which was maybe the most honest thing she could say about it. She had moved past him, the way you move past a bad year, not without scars, but without wanting to burn the calendar. She almost threw the invitation away. She almost did. Instead, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror on Saturday evening and told herself a quiet, practical thing. You have nothing to prove and nothing to fear. You go. You show your face, you leave. She didn't own a gown. She didn't have the budget for one, not with bar exam prep fees and rent stacking up the way they were. She put on the green dress, the one she'd worn to her cousin's graduation dinner, and she did her hair carefully, and she put on the small gold earrings her mother had given her, and she told herself that would be enough. It was a lie she almost believed. The Harrington Grand Ballroom was everything she had expected, and nothing she was ready for. Crystal and soft lighting, and women in gowns that probably cost more than Elena's monthly salary, and the particular kind of laughter that circles a room like weatherlight and easy for the people inside it. Suffocating if you're trying to enter from outside. She handed her coat to the attendant at the door. She straightened her shoulders. She walked in. She had made it approximately 4 steps before Marcus saw her. He was standing near the center of the room, holding a glass of champagne, surrounded by a cluster of men who laughed at everything he said, because that's what you do when someone is about to become part of the Harrington name. He was dressed in a tuxedo that fit perfectly, and his hair was the same as it always was. And for one brief, stupid second, Elena felt something she immediately resented, not love, not longing, just the ordinary disorientation of seeing someone who used to matter. Then he opened his mouth. "My God," he said, and pointed. Pointed, like she was something mounted on a wall. "Is that what you're wearing?" The laugh that followed wasn't one laugh. It was a chain reaction. Marcus first, then the men around him, then a ripple outward, as heads turned, and people who hadn't been paying attention suddenly were. Elena felt her face go carefully, deliberately neutral. She had learned to do that. She had spent years learning to do that, to take whatever came at her from the outside and fold it down into something small enough that she could breathe around it. She kept walking. Her plan was simple. Find a seat, find someone worth talking to, stay exactly long enough to not look like she'd been run out, and leave. But Marcus wasn't finished. Elena. He said her name like it was a punchline. "I genuinely didn't think you'd come." He turned to the men around him. We dated, years ago. She was in law school at the time. He paused. Still in law school, if I had to guess. Still, Elena said before she could stop herself. Some of us actually planned to finish. It came out flatter than she intended. More tired than sharp. And instead of silencing him, it made the corner of his mouth pull up. There she is, he said, like he was presenting her to the room. Always with the comeback. She found a table near the edge. She sat. She placed her small clutch in front of her, and she put her hands in her lap, and she focused on breathing in a way that didn't show. Around her, the conversation resumed its normal volume, but something had shifted. She could feel it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. People were aware of her now, not in a good way, in the way a room is aware of a crack in the ceiling. A woman she didn't know leaned toward a companion and said something that contained the words green dress and generated a quiet laugh Elena was not meant to hear and heard completely. She picked up the glass of water in front of her and drank from it slowly. You don't have to be here, said a voice in her head, her own voice, the practical one. There is no rule that says you have to sit here and take this. But there was another voice, older and more stubborn, the one that had gotten her through night school and the death of her father and every partner at the firm who had looked past her when she walked into the room. You belong here as much as any of them. You don't run. So she stayed. The dinner service began. The room settled into the particular rhythm of expensive, careful courses, attentive waitstaff, conversations overlapping like water. Marcus worked the room the way he always had, moving from cluster to cluster, and Elena watched him from her peripheral vision with the careful, clinical detachment of someone who has finally processed an old emotion down to its bare components. She was almost relaxed when Celeste Harrington sat down. Celeste was beautiful in the specific way that money and effort and a certain kind of cold confidence produce symmetrical and polished and absolutely certain of her own coordinates in any room she entered. She sat across from Elena with the slow, deliberate ease of someone who has never needed to hurry anywhere in her life. You're Elena, she said. Not a question, I am, Elena said. Marcus mentioned you. Celeste picked up her wine glass. He said you two were friends once, in college or something. We dated for 2 years, Elena said, after college. Something moved behind Celeste's eyes. Not surprise, something more calculated than surprise. She said, and the sound carried enough to suggest that Elena had just confirmed a theory. You work in law? Celeste continued. He said you were studying law. I'm a paralegal. I'm also preparing for the bar exam. That's ambitious, Celeste said, in the tone that wealthy people use when they mean something closer to quaint. She looked at Elena's dress, the way you look at a menu item you would never order. You must work very hard. I do, Elena said simply. Celeste smiled. It was a practiced smile, constructed from the outside in. It must be interesting, she said, setting down her glass, to be here tonight. See Marcus like this. He's done so well. She let that settle. We both have. Elena held her gaze. Congratulations, she said. On the engagement. Celeste's smile didn't change. Thank you. She rose. Enjoy the evening. She drifted away like smoke. Elena sat with it. The air around the exchange was still uncomfortable, that particular residue of something said politely, that was meant as a weapon. She turned it over. She had encountered it before, this specific variety of cruelty that wears the costume of pleasantry, that smiles while it presses its thumb into the bruise. She was good at not reacting. She was less good at not feeling it. Burst of laughter rose from across the room, Marcus's table. A group of men who all had the same posture, the same cut of jacket, the same particular ease that comes from never having had to worry about the bill. Elena didn't catch the specific words, but she heard her name. She was almost sure she heard her name. She looked down at her plate. 23 days until the bar exam. 23 days, and then she would walk out of that testing room, and she would have something that no one in this room could take from her, or diminish or make the subject of a joke. 23 days. She was reminding herself of this, running the arithmetic of her own future like a small private engine when the man across the table cleared his throat. He was older, maybe 60, with the kind of face that has been weathered rather than aged, and he had been sitting there quietly since the dinner began, which she had appreciated without registering it as anything deliberate. "I couldn't help but overhear," he said, with a careful kind of courtesy, "when Voss introduced you earlier." "That wasn't an introduction," Elena said. No, the man agreed. It wasn't. He extended his hand across the table. "Gerald Park. I used to run contracts for Voss Holdings, before they restructured." Elena shook his hand. "Elena Marlowe." "I know who you are," Gerald said mildly. "You drafted the Kellerman brief, the employment discrimination case in 2021. Elena went still. "How do you know that?" "Because Kellerman won," he said. "And because the brief was submitted under the firm's senior partner's name. But the language in it was too careful to be his. I've read enough of his work." He picked up his fork. "You should have gotten credit for that." She didn't know what to say to that. Nobody had ever said that directly to her before she had known it privately, in the way you know things about yourself that the world has not yet caught up to. But hearing it from outside her own skull was something different. "The partner didn't think so," she said. Gerald nodded slowly, like he was filing something away. "A lot of people in Voss's circle don't think much of what they can't see," he said. "That's their limitation, not yours." He said it without drama. Just a flat, observational fact, the kind that hits differently, precisely because it isn't trying to comfort you. Elena turned back to her plate and tried to eat. She was genuinely trying to stay inside her own sense of purpose, to treat this room as the irrelevant backdrop it ought to be, when Marcus materialized at the edge of her table with a fresh drink and that particular expansiveness of a man who has had enough champagne to believe he is at his most charming. "Elena." He pulled out a chair and sat without being invited to. "Having a good time?" "Fine," she said. "You look exactly the same," he said, which wasn't a compliment. "I mean, I don't know. I thought maybe." He gestured vaguely at her dress, at her general vicinity. "You thought maybe what?" she said. He spread his hands. "I don't know. You always talked about all the things you were going to do. Thought maybe by now." Another vague gesture. "I'm 29 days away from having completed everything I set out to do," she said. "Give or take the bar results." Right. He nodded like she'd said something cute. "The bar exam." He said the bar exam the way some people say your little project. "That's impressive, really. For someone juggling," he waved at the invisible complexity of her life, everything. "For someone," she said. He caught the edge in it, and his expression shifted just slightly, the way it used to when she called something out that he didn't want called out. "I'm just saying it's hard. You've always made things harder than they need to be, Elena." "You always did." He stopped. "Could have what?" "You could have stayed," he said, and there was something underneath it now, something not quite apology and not quite accusation. Instead, he stopped again. "Instead of what, Marcus?" Her voice was very even. She had learned to make her voice even. Instead of building a life that doesn't depend on anyone else deciding I deserve one. The table nearest them had gone quiet. Marcus's jaw tightened. And then something happened to his face that she recognized the moment when a person who is losing an argument decides to win the room instead. He stood. He raised his voice just enough. "You know what I love about you, Elena?" he said to her and to everyone. "You always act like the smartest person in the room." Even when he looked at her dress, deliberately, slowly, you clearly didn't prepare for the room you were walking into. A laugh went around. Not everyone, but enough. Elena set down her fork. She looked at him. She looked at him, the way she had learned to look at things that hurt her directly, without flinching, without giving away the interior damage. She had a response ready. Several, in fact. She had lived with Marcus long enough to know every weak point in the architecture of his ego, and she could have used any of them. She said nothing. She picked up her clutch. She had decided, in that precise moment, that no argument she won in this room was worth the energy it would cost her. That she had 23 days until an exam that would open every door this room would never willingly open for her. That Marcus Voss was not a chapter she needed to write another word in. She pushed back her chair. She stood, and that was when the main doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and the room did something she hadn't seen it do all evening. It went quiet. not the quiet of people pausing, the quiet of people aware. The kind of hush that happens when something enters a space that changes the weight of the air. She didn't turn around immediately. She watched the faces around her, instead watched the way the laughter drained out of them, watched the way even Marcus's expression recalibrated. Something flickered behind his eyes, uncertainty maybe, or something closer to recognition without understanding. She turned. The man walking through the door was not large, not in the way that announces itself with size. He was lean and somewhere in his early 40s, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a dark suit that had been cut precisely to his measurements by someone who charged accordingly. He moved without hurry. He looked at no one in particular, and yet managed to look at everyone, the way certain people do, the way certain when rooms have been quieting for them, long enough that they've stopped noticing it. He scanned the ballroom once, and then his eyes found her. Not the table, not the commotion Marcus had been performing. Her. She had no idea who he was, but the room clearly did. Because nobody laughed anymore. Nobody moved, and Marcus, who had been holding court with a champagne glass and a performing grin 30 seconds ago, lowered his drink very slowly and said nothing. Elena stood there with her clutch in her hand, halfway between sitting and leaving, and she watched the stranger cross the room toward her, and she had the oddest sensation not of being rescued, but of a story she hadn't known. She was inside suddenly revealing its shape. She had spent her whole life building toward a room like this. She had never expected it to start by having someone like him walk through the door. But that was the thing about the kind of strength people build quietly, in the dark, while no one is watching. Sometimes it finds its own defenders before it even knows it needs them. The man stopped 2 feet from her. He looked at her once, a look that was not pity, and not interest, and not performance, but something far more deliberate. Then he turned and looked at Marcus, and he said, with the perfect, unhurried calm of a man who has never needed volume to make a room listen, "Do you know who you've been laughing at?" The question didn't need a follow-up. It just sat there in the middle of the Harrington Grand Ballroom, like something dropped from a single clean sentence that had landed, and was now spreading outward through the room the way a crack spreads through glass, slow and then all at once. "Do you know who you've been laughing at?" Marcus Voss blinked. The champagne glass in his hand hadn't moved, but the knuckles around it had tightened. Elena caught that detail, because she had learned years ago to read Marx through his hands before his face. His face was trained. His hands always told the truth. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, and it came out with the particular texture of a man who is not sorry at all, but is buying himself 3 seconds to recalibrate. "Do I know you?" The man Dominic Hail, though Elena wouldn't know his name for another 4 minutes, didn't answer immediately. He had the infuriating patience of someone who has never been rushed by another person's discomfort. He looked at Marcus the way you look at a number on a page you're about to correct. "You don't," Dominic said. "That's the problem." A server passed between them carrying a tray of empty glasses, and Dominic let the interruption happen without adjusting his posture even slightly. He simply waited for the server to clear the space, and then continued looking at Marcus with that same flat, unhurried attention. Marcus set down his champagne glass on the nearest table. Elena noticed that his fiancée, Celeste, had materialized at the edge of the group, appeared the way expensive women appear at events, as if summoned by social gravity rather than actual movement. She stood at Marcus's left shoulder with her wine glass held loosely and her expression arranged into something that was trying very hard to be amusement and landing closer to caution. "I don't know what's happening right now," Marcus said, and he laughed, a short, reflexive sound that he directed at the men around him, pulling them in as witnesses, as backup, as a kind of social armor. "But this is a private event, and I don't believe you were on the guest list." "I wasn't," Dominic said. "Then I was invited by Thomas Harrington." He said the name quietly. "Not as a weapon, as a fact. Your future father-in-law. We have an arrangement. He told me to come by." The laugh died somewhere between Marcus's chest and his mouth. Celeste's wine glass stopped moving. Elena watched the specific moment When Marcus understood that the ground beneath his performance had shifted, she had seen that moment on his face before, years ago, when she had finally sat him down and told him she was leaving. It was the expression of a man who has been playing a game and has just realized the other person changed the rules 3 moves ago without telling him. "Thomas invited you," Marcus said. "He did. And you are." Dominic Hail. The name landed differently in different parts of the room. Elena watched it move a ripple of recognition that spread from the people nearest to Dominic outward, each ripple slightly different in quality. Some people went still. Some people took a small step backward, with the careful, instinctive quality of a person who has spotted something on a trail. Gerald Park, the man who had spoken to Elena at dinner, sat up very straight in his chair. Marcus, to his credit or his ruin, held his ground. Dominic Hail, he repeated, and you could hear him searching the name in his memory, filing through contacts and dinner parties and business articles, looking for the entry that would tell him how worried to be. "I don't think we haven't," Dominic said. "I know who you are, though, Marcus Voss, Voss Holdings. Commercial real estate, 3 primary funds, and the Kellerman subsidiary that handles the smaller development contracts." He paused. "The ones that don't go through the main accounts." The room held its breath. Elena's hand tightened around her clutch. Marcus's expression didn't break. She had to give him that. He had always been good at the surface, but something behind his eyes shifted with the quality of a light going out in a room 2 floors above you. "Barely visible. Definitely real. I'm not sure what you think you know," Marcus said, "but this isn't the time or the place." "You were publicly mocking this woman 30 seconds ago," Dominic said. "In front of 60 people. You pointed at her dress and you laughed." He said it without heat, without theater, just the precise clinical sequence of what had happened. "So I think the time and the place are actually exactly right." Elena felt something shift in her chest, not gratitude. Not yet. Something more complicated than gratitude. Something that felt like being handed a mirror and finally seeing your own face clearly after a long time of avoiding it. "This is my engagement dinner," Marcus said, and his voice had picked up an edge, now not quite anger, not quite fear, something vibrating between them. "And Elena and I have a complicated history, and I was just—" "You were just what?" Dominic said. Marcus stopped. "Finish the sentence," Dominic said. "You were just what?" Reminding her where she stands? Reminding the room who's important here? He looked around at the assembled guests with the measured, unhurried gaze of a man taking inventory. "I'm curious what the rest of the sentence sounds like." Celeste touched Marcus's arm. The touch was light, but loaded. Elena recognized it as the kind of touch that means stop talking, the kind that one person delivers to another when they've assessed the situation faster and seen something the other one hasn't yet. Marcus felt it. He shifted his weight. Dominic said, a new voice, and a man materialized from the edge of the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who has spent a lifetime smoothing things over. He was in his late 60s, white-haired, with the broad, solid build of a man who had been athletic once and had transitioned into powerful. Thomas Harrington. Elena had seen his photo in the business section. "I'm glad you made it." Dominic turned. The temperature of his expression shifted, not warmer, exactly, but less pointed. "Thomas." They shook hands with the ease of men who have shaken hands across a table where real things were at stake, where the handshake meant something beyond social ritual. "I see you've met Marcus," Thomas said, with a particular flatness that told Elena he had been watching from somewhere nearby. "We've been getting acquainted," Dominic said. Thomas looked at Marcus for a moment. It was a brief look, the kind a father-in-law gives a future son-in-law when he is deciding how much of his disappointment to display in public. "Marcus," he said, "why don't you introduce Dominic to some of the other guests? I need a word with him first." He turned to Elena. "Ms. Marlowe, I want to apologize for the way the evening began." Elena blinked. She had not expected that. "You know who I am," she said. "Gerald Park worked for me for 11 years before he went to Voss Holdings," Thomas said. "He's mentioned you more than once. The Kellerman brief, specifically. Something moved in the old man's eyes, not quite regret, but something adjacent to it. That was exceptional work." Elena stood very still. She didn't know what to do with kindness in a room that had just been unkind to her. She never had. It always hit her in the wrong place, pressed against something too close to the surface. And she had to be careful not to let it show. "Thank you," she said. "Just that. Nothing more." Thomas nodded once, then guided Dominic away with a gentle hand, and the crowd around Marcus dissolved into the ordinary motion of a party, resuming after a disruption. And suddenly Elena was standing in a small clearing of quiet, her clutch in her hand, the exit still visible behind her. She could still leave. Part of her said she should. But her feet didn't move. She went back to her table. She sat. Gerald Park was still there, and he looked at her with an expression that contained a complicated amount of information, and then he simply handed her the bread basket without a word, which was possibly the most appropriate thing anyone had done all evening. "How do you know Thomas Harrington?" she asked. "I worked for him," Gerald said. "Years ago. Before he set up the Harrington Group separately from his personal holdings." He tore a piece of bread slowly. "And I know Dominic Hail, by reputation mostly." "What is his reputation?" Elena said. Gerald chewed, considered, chewed some more. "The kind," he said finally, "that makes men like Marcus Voss put their champagne glasses down." Elena looked across the room to where Dominic Hail stood with Thomas Harrington, the two of them speaking in the low, complete way of men in the middle of a real conversation rather than a social performance. Dominic had his back half turned to the room. He wasn't working the crowd. He wasn't performing anything. She had known men who were powerful, in the way that Marcus was powerful inherited, leveraged, dependent on other people's perception of it, always requiring an audience. She had the specific, unnameable sense that Dominic Hale's power was a different species entirely. She looked away. She was not going to sit here and construct a story about a man she had met 4 minutes ago. She had 23 days until the bar exam. She ate her dinner. She was halfway through the main course when Marcus came back. He didn't sit this time. He stood at the edge of her table with his hands in his pockets and his jaw doing the thing it did when he was trying to look casual, while his interior was working very hard at something else. "Lena," he said, "can we talk? Somewhere quieter?" She looked up at him. "No, I just want to..." Her voice was flat and clear. "We don't have anything to talk about." "I think we do," he said, and now the ease in his voice had frayed at the edges. "I think you came here tonight with something to prove, and I think you've spent a lot of energy." "I came here tonight because you sent me an invitation," she said. "That was your choice. Everything that's happened since I walked in that door has been your choice. I'm not responsible for any of it. I'm not saying you're..." "What do you want?" she said. He stopped. He looked at her with the specific frustration of a man who is used to being able to manage a conversation and has lost the thread of this one. "I want to know what you said to him," he said. "Dominic Hail." "What did you say to him?" "How do you..." "I didn't say anything to him," Elena said. "I didn't know who he was before tonight, but he..." Marcus lowered his voice. "He came straight to you, yes," Elena said. "He did." Marcus stared at her. Something moved through his expression that she had trouble naming. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was something more unsettled than jealousy. Something that looked like a man discovering that the map he's been using is for a completely different territory. "He's not someone you want involved in your business," Marcus said, and his voice had dropped further. "Whatever he told you or offered you, Elena, you should be careful." "I appreciate the concern," she said, with a politeness that was precisely as thin as it needed to be. Marcus looked at her for another moment. Then he left. Elena watched him cross the room, watched him return to Celeste's side, watched the two of them have a brief, tense exchange that Celeste ended by turning her back and resuming a conversation with someone else. Celeste was better at this than Marcus, better at reading the room, better at cutting losses, better at the social arithmetic of when to push and when to fold. She filed that away. She wasn't sure why she filed it away, only that she had always had the instinct to notice things that might matter later, even when she didn't yet know how. The evening wore on. Dessert was served. Toasts were made. Thomas Harrington gave one that was warm and measured, and the best man gave one that was slightly too long and drew polite laughter at the right intervals. Elena sat and watched and felt the particular exhaustion of being a person who spends energy not reacting, not responding, keeping the surface still while the underneath churns. She was putting on her coat at the cloakroom when she heard footsteps behind her, and knew without turning around that it was him. She turned anyway. Dominic Hail stood at a careful, non-threatening distance with his hands in his jacket pockets and an expression that she still couldn't fully read, which bothered her more than she wanted to acknowledge. "You stayed," he said. "I was leaving," she said. "I had been leaving." "You interrupted." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "Fair enough," he said. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask," she said. "I make no promises about answering." He nodded, accepting the condition without argument. "Kellerman v. Hartwell Industries," he said. "The brief that won the case." "You wrote it," she went. Still, it was the second time tonight someone had said that to her, and it still landed like cold water because nobody was supposed to know that. Partner's name was on it. His name was always on things. "Why do you think that?" she said carefully. "Because I had someone read it after the case was settled," he said. "And then I had them read 6 months of briefs from the same firm with the partner's actual name on them." The difference was significant. He looked at her steadily. "You have a particular way of structuring an argument. You establish the emotional premise before the legal one. It's unusual, it works." "You had someone analyze legal briefs," she said. "Why?" "Because I was looking at the firm for other reasons," he said. "And I noticed the anomaly." "What other reasons?" she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Voss Holdings has a contract with that firm," he said. "The partner handles several of their accounts. The accounts are interesting." She held his gaze. "How interesting?" "Interesting enough," he said, "that I've spent the last 4 months building a complete picture of how Marcus Voss has been running the financial structure of his company." He paused. "And interesting enough that a significant portion of the opportunity that built Voss Holdings in the first place traces back to research and drafting work done by a paralegal named Elena Marlowe that Marcus Voss presented to investors as his own original analysis." Cloakroom was quiet. Somewhere behind the wall, the party continued. Elena could hear the low murmur of it, the occasional burst of laughter, the sound of a world that had been unkind to her for an entire evening continuing to turn without particular concern for what she was feeling right now. She put her coat on slowly. She needed something to do with her hands. "That's a significant claim," she said. "I have documentation," he said. "Emails, internal memos, the original drafts with your name in the metadata." She looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," he said, "you were halfway out the door of a room that had been trying to make you feel small for 2 hours, and I watched you not let them. And I've been watching Marcus Voss present borrowed work as genius for long enough that the combination became." He paused, choosing the word with the care of someone who doesn't use them carelessly relevant. "Relevant," she repeated. "To me," he said, "yes." She studied him. She was good at reading. People, it was a skill she had built. Out of necessity, out of years of being in rooms where she had to understand the dynamics faster than everyone else just to stay level. She was looking for the angle. She was looking for what he wanted, because everyone wanted something, and men who walked into ballrooms and made rooms go quiet did not give information about financial misconduct to strangers out of pure civic interest. "What do you get out of this?" she said. He looked at her steadily. "Marcus Voss has been making promises to business partners that he cannot keep and covering the gap with creative accounting. Several of those partners are people I have relationships with." His voice was even and precise. "When his structure collapses, and it will collapse, with or without your involvement, it creates problems for people who matter to me. I would prefer the collapse to be orderly and documented rather than sudden and messy." She absorbed that. It was honest, she thought. Or at least, it was a kind of honest, the kind that shows you the part of the motivation that is defensible and leaves the rest in the dark where she can't examine it. But it tracked. It was internally consistent in a way that random goodwill rarely is. "And you want me to do what exactly?" she said. "I want you to take the documentation," he said. "I want you to look at it. I want you to decide what to do with it. And if I decide to do nothing, then you do nothing," he said. It's yours. I'm not attaching conditions. She looked at him for a long time. You don't know me, she said. No, he agreed. So why? Because the brief was exceptional, he said simply. And because you sat in that room for 2 hours while people who are significantly less intelligent than you laughed at your clothes, and you didn't break. He held her gaze. I find that kind of endurance worth something. She didn't respond to that. She didn't trust herself to respond to that. I'll think about it, she said. He reached into his jacket and produced a card, not a business card with a title printed on it, just a card with a number. Took it. The paper was heavy between her fingers. She put it in her clutch. She walked out of the Harrington Grand Ballroom and into the cold air of the street, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the sounds of the city falling around her, and she breathed. She thought about Marcus, about the 2 years, about the Kellerman brief that she had drafted in a coffee shop at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday night with a cold cup of tea beside her, the one the partner had submitted under his own name the following morning without a conversation, without an acknowledgement, without so much as a change in how he said good morning to her in the hallway. She thought about the metadata. She thought about what documentation meant, what it could mean, what it could open or close. She thought about 23 days. She started walking. Her apartment was 12 blocks. She had done the walk 100 times. She knew which streetlights flickered, and she knew which corners smelled like the bakery that opened at 4 in the morning, and she needed the familiar rhythm of it right now. Needed the concrete and the cold and the ordinary city noise to settle something in her that was vibrating at a frequency she didn't entirely trust. She was 8 blocks from home when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Marcus. She stared at his name for the length of 3 rings. Then she answered. Marcus, she said. Where are you? His voice was different from the voice at the party. The performance was gone. What was left underneath was something she had heard only a few times in 2 years, a frequency she associated with him being genuinely scared rather than just uncomfortable. Walking home, she said. You talked to him, Marcus said. Don't tell me you didn't. He came straight to you when you left. He said, hello, Elena said carefully, Elena. A breath. Something jagged in it. Listen to me. Whatever Dominic Hail said to you, whatever he offered you, whatever he implied about me or my company, he has an agenda. He has people he protects and people he uses, and you do not want to be a piece on his board. That's interesting advice, she said, from the man who pointed at me in front of 60 people and laughed at my dress. Silence on the line. I was out of line tonight, Marcus said. I know that. I don't handle seeing you well, Elena, and I handled it badly, and I'm sorry for that. Genuinely. She waited. But Hail is dangerous, he said. Not in the way people use that word when they just mean powerful. I mean, actually, his voice dropped. Actually dangerous. The things I've heard about how he handles problems. Elena. What problems, she said. Business problems, Marcus said. Competitors. People who got in the way of things he wanted. Another breath. People have lost things. Real things. Companies, reputations, in some cases more than that. She kept walking. The bakery corner. The flickering streetlight on Morrison. 12 blocks had become 3. Marcus, she said, are you calling me because you're worried about me? Or because you're worried about yourself? A long silence. Both, he said, and for a moment, one single, small moment, she believed him. Not the concern for her, necessarily, but the fear. That part she believed entirely. I haven't done anything, she said. I'm going home. Elena. Good night, Marcus. She ended the call. She stood outside her building for a moment before going in, looking up at the narrow between the buildings, feeling the cold on her face. Card was still in her clutch. She took it out. She looked at the number. Just digits, no name, no title, no indication of who he was or what he represented beyond the weight of the paper. She went inside. She sat at her kitchen table with the card in front of her and her study materials arranged around it the way they always were, color-coded tabs, the 2 highlighters she used, the yellow legal pad where she wrote out rule statements by hand because her retention was better that way. She picked up the card again. She thought about the Kellerman brief. She thought about the 11 o'clock coffee shop and the cold tea. She thought about the partner walking past her desk the morning after the verdict without stopping, without a word, signing himself into her work with the casual ease of a man who had never questioned his right to do it. She thought about the metadata. She picked up her phone. She was not going to call the number. Not tonight. Not yet. She was going to think clearly and carefully, and she was going to remember that she had 23 days left, and that was the thing that mattered, the thing she had worked toward, the thing that no one could subtract from her. But she was also in a chamber of herself that she kept locked and did not examine often, quietly furious. Had been for a long time, had been managing that fury with the discipline of a person who knows that fire in the wrong direction burns the arsonist too. The card was still in her hand. She thought about Marcus's voice on the phone, the frequency underneath it, the genuine fear. She thought about what specific kind of documentation could produce that frequency in a man like Marcus Voss. She put the card down on the legal pad. She opened her evidence textbook. She told herself she was going to study. And she did study for 40 minutes, maybe 50, running through hearsay exceptions and authentication requirements, and the clean procedural grammar of evidence law that she loved for its exactness, its insistence that things be proven, that claims require support, that the truth is not self-evident but demonstrable. It was during the section on business, the authentication of financial documents, the paper trail that corporations leave whether they intend to or not, the way internal memos can survive the people who wrote them, that she stopped reading. She sat very still. Her phone was on the table. The card was beside it. She thought about business records. She thought about metadata. She thought about emails and internal memos and original drafts and the specific, meticulous kind of documentation that a man like Dominic Hail would assemble over 4 months if he was building a case. She thought about what it would mean to walk into the bar exam, having already won something, having already stood up in a room where she had been made small, and made herself large, not with volume, not with rage, but with the precise, documented, irrefutable truth. She picked up her phone. She looked at the number on the card one more time. She dialed. It rang twice. Marlowe, Dominic Hail said, and he didn't sound surprised. And she wasn't sure if that unsettled her or steadied her. Only that the call was already made and there was no direction anymore, but forward. "Tell me about the documentation," she said. A beat of silence. "Not hesitation consideration. Are you asking to see it," he said, "or asking me to describe it?" "Both," she said, "starting with what you have on the Kellerman drafts." And across the city, in a room she had never seen, Dominic Hail began to talk. And Elena Marlowe, 23 days from the bar exam, sitting at a kitchen table surrounded by color-coded study materials and a cold cup of tea that had been steeping too long, listened with the focused, complete attention of a woman who has just decided to stop surviving a situation and start dismantling it. There was no going back from this call. She knew that when she dialed anyway. The call lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Elena knew the exact duration, because she was still sitting at the kitchen table when she finally set the phone down, and she looked at the clock above the stove, the way you look at something ordinary, when the extraordinary has just finished happening to you, and it said 1:47 in the morning, and she had dialed at 11:33. And somewhere in those 2 hours and 14 minutes, the geometry of everything she thought she understood about the last 4 years of her life had quietly, completely rearranged itself. She sat very still. The legal pad in front of her was covered in notes. She had written automatically, the way she did in depositions, not thinking about the act of writing, just listening and transcribing, her hand moving while the front part of her brain processed what was being said. Now she looked at what she'd written, and the notes looked like something from someone else's life. Kellerman brief original metadata, saved draft 11:08 p.m., her login credentials, her workstation ID. 14 investor presentations, 2019 2022. Sourced analysis traced to internal research memos under her name. The Crane Street development, the Whitmore portfolio. The Alderton contracts, Her name else, the footnotes of documents Marcus that Marcus had removed her name from before presenting. The number beside the Alderton contract's entry was not a small number. She put her pen down. She looked at the yellow legal pad for a long time without reading it. Then she got up and filled a glass of water at the sink and drank half of it, standing there and looked out the kitchen window at the dark rectangle of the alley below, and thought about nothing specific for approximately 30 seconds, which was all she could manage before the specific came flooding back in. She had known, in the way you know something you are not ready to quantify, the way the partner had never credited her, the way Marcus had always been vague when she asked about outcomes, the way investor calls had sometimes referenced things she recognized as her own conclusions delivered in someone else's cadence. She had known it the way you know a room is cold before you put a number to the temperature. But knowing in the body and having it documented in black and white are different animals entirely. She finished the water. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, she dreamed about the bar exam, the specific recurring anxiety dream she'd been having for months, where she sits down at the testing table and opens the booklet, and none of the questions are in any language she recognizes. She woke at 6:15 with her jaw aching from clenching and her heart rate already elevated and the yellow legal pad visible from the bed, sitting on the kitchen table where she'd left it. She got up. She made coffee. She sat back down with the legal pad, and she read through her own notes with the cold, deliberate attention she used when she was reviewing evidence for a case, which was what this was now. She called Dominic Hail at 7:30. He answered on the second ring, which told her either that he had been awake or that he slept lightly, and she filed both possibilities away without deciding between them. "I need to see the physical documentation," she said. "Not descriptions. The actual files." "I can arrange that," he said. "When today?" she said. A pause brief, one beat. 11 o'clock. "I'll send you an address." He ended the call. She showered and dressed with the mechanical efficiency of someone whose mind is entirely elsewhere. She put on dark slacks and a white button-down, and her good coat, the charcoal one, because she had learned a long time ago that how you present yourself in a room before people know who you are determines how long it takes them to take you seriously, and she did not have time to waste on that process today. The address Dominic sent was not the kind of address she had expected. She had imagined something in the financial district, glass and steel, a lobby with security badges and expensive art on the walls. The address was in the Meridian District, in a building that looked like it had been a printing warehouse in a previous life, with a plain door and no signage and a security panel beside it that beeped once when she pressed the buzzer. A voice she didn't recognize said Ms. Marlowe, and the door clicked open. She went inside. The interior was nothing like the exterior. Not opulent, nothing so deliberate as opulent, just precise. A space that had been organized by someone who thought in terms of function, Beaufort, aesthetics, and the result was a room that felt controlled rather than decorated. Long tables, filing systems, 2 computers with large monitors, a window that looked out on nothing, 3 people in the room who looked up when she entered and then immediately back at their work. Dominic was standing at the far end of a table that held 4 stacked boxes of documents. He was in different clothes than the night before, a dark shirt, with the collar open, no jacket, the sleeves rolled to the forearms in a way that made him look less like the man in the ballroom and more like someone who had been working since early. He had a coffee cup in one hand and a folder in the other, and he looked at her when she walked in the way he had looked at her across the ballroom, like he was verifying something. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said. "I slept some," she said. He set the folder on the table. "The Kellerman materials are in the first box," he said. "I had someone flag the specific pages. The metadata records are printed alongside the originals." She went to the first box. She pulled it toward her and opened it. She spent the next 3 hours in that room. She read with the same focused silence she used in the law library at night, moving through pages methodically, cross-referencing, building the architecture of the thing in her head as she went. Nobody bothered her. Dominic worked at the other end of the table. Coffee appeared at her elbow at some point. She drank it without looking up. The documentation was thorough in a way that made her uncomfortable for reasons she couldn't immediately name. Not uncomfortable with the content was exactly what Dominic had described, and each new file confirmed the last with the clean, cumulative weight of a well-built case. Uncomfortable with the thoroughness itself, with the specificity, with the sense that someone had spent considerable time and considerable resources assembling this particular portrait of Marcus Voss. She found the page that made her stop. It was an internal email chain from 3 years ago. Marcus to the senior partner at the firm. The chain discussed, in the casual tone of men who believe their communications are private, the best approach to restructuring the credit on 2 specific projects. The phrase used was consolidating the attribution. There was a follow-up email in which the partner confirmed that he had spoken to HR and that Elena Marlowe's contract would be reclassified to limit her intellectual property claims going forward. She read that one twice. She set it down. She looked at the wall in front of her, which was bare concrete, and she felt something in the vicinity of her sternum that was not grief and not anger and not shock, but a specific compound of all 3 that had no good name. Partner. She had liked the partner. She had respected him. She had stayed late for him. She had believed, and this was the part that sat in the compound, like acid. She had genuinely believed that he respected her in return, that the arrangement was inequitable in the ways she understood and acceptable in the ways she had decided to accept, and that the work was being done, and that eventually, when the time was right, her name would be on things. She had been a 27-year-old woman who needed the job and had told herself a story that made the arrangement survivable. She understood that. She did not blame the woman she had been, but she was not that woman anymore. She closed the box. She turned to Dominic. The partner, she said. Richard Kane. He's in this. He's in several things, Dominic said, without looking up from what he was reading. He knew, she said. He signed off on reclassifying my contract specifically to cut off my IP claims. That's in box 1. Email chain 3 years ago. Dominic looked up now. He set down what he was reading. I know, he said. I should have led with that. I started with the Marcus materials because I thought. You should have led with that, she said. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. I should have. She looked at the boxes. 4 of them. She had been through one. How much of this involves Kane directly? Enough, he said. He's been serving as the legal architecture for Marcus's financial restructuring. The contracts that moved the Kellerman compensation away from the associates were drafted out of Kane's office. Elena sat down. She had not planned to sit down. Her legs made the decision. She put both hands flat on the table and breathed through the specific kind of vertigo that comes not from standing up too fast, but from understanding something too completely. Because what Dominic was describing, what the emails confirmed, what the restructured contract meant, was not just Marcus taking credit for her work. It was a coordinated arrangement between Marcus and the man she worked for every day, the man who signed her performance reviews, the man who had told her twice in 3 years that she was exceptional and had her on a track for partnership. Track for partnership. She heard those words in Richard Kane's voice, and they sounded completely different now than they had when he said them. How long have you known Kane was involved? She said. 7 weeks, Dominic said. And you didn't tell me that last night. Last night I didn't know what you would do with it, he said. I needed to understand what kind of person you are before I handed you something that could be used in multiple directions. She looked at him. What kind of person am I? The kind, he said, who reads 3 hours of financial documentation on 4 hours of sleep and still catches the specific email I was deciding whether to flag first. He paused. Careful kind, which is what this requires. She was quiet for a moment. She was running calculations, not numbers, but variables. Kane's firm, her current position in that firm, the bar exam in 22 days. The employment contract she had signed 3 years ago, the one that had apparently been reclassified without her knowledge. Question of whether a reclassification she hadn't consented to was even legally enforceable. I need a copy of my original employment contract, she said. The one I signed when I first joined the firm. I have it, Dominic said. She looked at him. I have a complete file on your employment history at Kane's firm, he said, including the original contract and the modified version filed 18 months later. They're in box 3. She stood up. She went to box 3. She found the documents within 4 minutes because they were flagged with a red tab, and she pulled out both contracts and laid them side by side on the table, and she read them with the particular focus of a person who is looking for the specific language of their own diminishment. It was there, buried in the modified intellectual property clause, in the kind of dense contractual language designed to be readable only to someone looking for it. The original contract granted her standard IP rights over work product created in the course of her employment. The modified version, the one filed without her signature, she noted, without her signature contained a carve-out that assigned all IP rights to the firm in perpetuity for any work product created using firm resources. Using firm resources, she had written the Kellerman brief on a firm computer, in a firm office, on a firm night when she was working late because she was always working late. Her hands were very steady. She was proud of how steady her hands were. This modified contract, she said, doesn't have my signature. No, Dominic said, which means it's not a modification. It's a unilateral internal filing that was never disclosed to me. That's correct, which means my original IP rights were never legally transferred. That's my read, he said, though you're the one studying for the bar exam. She almost laughed. It was a short, humorless sound, barely more than an exhale, but it was the closest thing to laughter that the morning had produced. She put the contracts back in box 3. She turned to face the room, the concrete walls, the fluorescent lighting, the 3 people who were studiously not watching her process, the dismantling of her professional life. She thought about what came next. She had documentation. She had a clear legal argument regarding the IP rights. She had evidence of coordinated financial misconduct by Marcus Voss and financial and legal misconduct by Richard Kane. She had 22 days until the bar exam. She realized everything she needed to build a case. And then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. A number she recognized. Not Marcus this time. Not Kane. Her paralegal colleague, Destiny. A woman she had worked alongside for 2 years. A woman who knew the inside of the firm, the way you know the inside of a house you've lived in for a long time, every creaking board, every drafty window. Elena answered. Des, she said. Elena. Destiny's voice had a quality she recognized immediately, a tightness, that meant the call was being made from somewhere she wasn't supposed to be making it from, probably the stairwell. I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you fast. Elena gripped the phone. Tell me. Kane called a firm meeting this morning, Destiny said. You weren't on the notification list. I only know because I was in early, and I saw the calendar. Elena went still. What kind of meeting? The kind where HR is present, Destiny said. Elena, they're pulling your access. I saw a memo on the printer. I saw it by accident. I swear, and your name was on it. They're reclassifying your position effective this week. The reason listed is a conflict of interest investigation. The room around Elena did not change. The concrete walls were where they had been. The fluorescent lights continued their indifferent hum. The 3 people continued their work. Everything else restructured. Conflict of interest, Elena said. Do you know what that's about? Destiny's voice was carefully neutral in the way of someone trying to help without committing to anything documented. Elena looked at Dominic. He had set down everything in his hands and was watching her with the still, complete attention of a man tracking a situation in real time. I'm starting to, Elena said. Des, thank you. Don't say anything more on this line. Elena, I mean it. Thank you, she ended the call. She stood with the phone in her hand, and she worked through the timing. Dominic had contacted her at the dinner last night. She had called him back at 11:30. The call had lasted until after 1. And by this morning, Kane was already pulling her access and filing a conflict of interest investigation, which meant that someone had told Kane about last night. Someone at the dinner. Someone who had seen her talking to Dominic Hail and had understood the significance of that conversation in a way that she hadn't fully understood herself until 3 hours ago. She turned to face Dominic fully. Someone told Kane I was with you last night, she said. Dominic's expression didn't change. Marcus, he said. Called me when I was walking home, she said. He asked what I said to you. And this morning, Dominic said, he called Kane. Because Marcus knows enough about what Kane has done to understand what would happen if the two of them were exposed separately. He stood. He's trying to move first. By having me investigated for conflict of interest, she said. By having you removed from the firm before you have the bar results that make you a credible threat, Dominic said. Right now you're still a paralegal, with a conflict of interest notation on your file. Asina absorbed that. She sat down again. She needed a moment, and she gave herself exactly 1 moment before she shut the feeling down and replaced it with something usable. If they file a formal conflict of interest claim through the state bar, she said slowly, working through it aloud, it can delay my bar results even after I pass. It can trigger a character review. Yes, Dominic said. So even if I pass the exam in 22 days, if this complaint is filed before I'm admitted, the admission board has to review it. She looked at the boxes of documentation. They are trying to close the window. Before you can use any of this, Dominic said. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the window. She stood with her back to the room and looked at the nothing view, a concrete exterior wall, a narrow sky strip, a city going about its morning without any particular interest in the fact that hers was collapsing. She had been careful, she had been disciplined and precise, and she had spent 4 years building towards something specific, taking the long route because the long route was the one she could control. And in 48 hours from the moment she decided to pick up that invitation from the floor of her hallway, the long route had been cut off at both ends. The job she had now was in the process of being taken from her. Credential she was 22 days from earning was in the process of being weaponized against her. She turned back around. The conflict of interest claim, she said. For it to stick, they need to demonstrate actual conflict. They need to show I was acting against the firm's interests while employed there. Yes, Dominic said. If I can establish that my access to the documentation you have was post-employment, if my access is effectively terminated before I formally engage with any of this material, there's no conflict. The claim becomes procedurally empty. Dominic looked at her carefully. That would require you to resign before they fire you. Today, she said. It would require me to resign today, before they file anything formally. She met his eyes. If I resign this morning, there's no employment relationship to create a conflict. You'd be giving up the income, he said. I know what I'd be giving up. 22 days before the bar exam, he said. No salary. Exposed. I know, she said. Elena. He said her name with a gravity that wasn't warning and wasn't persuasion. Wait. If you do this, if you resign and engage with this material and decide to bring a case, you need to understand what Marcus and Kane will do in response. This does not stay quiet. This becomes public. Your name becomes part of a fight that has no clean ending, even if you win. My name is already in their documents, she said. It's been in their documents for 4 years. My name is in the metadata of briefs they stripped my name from. I am already in this. I was in this before I knew I was in this. She paused. The only question that was ever real is whether I do something about it. The room was quiet. One of the 3 workers had stopped pretending to work and was very still at their desk. Dominic looked at her for a long, measured moment. All right, he said. I need to use a computer, she said. He gestured to the workstation at the near end of the table. She sat down. She opened a browser. She went to her firm email. Her access was still active, which meant the termination hadn't been processed yet, which meant she still had time. She drafted her resignation letter in 11 minutes, which was longer than it should have taken. But she was choosing every word with the care of someone writing something that would be read by lawyers, because it would be. She kept it clean, effective immediately. No statement of grievance. No language that could be characterized as hostile. Just a formal, precise, undeniable end of the employment relationship. She read it 3 times. She pressed send. She sat back. She waited for the specific feeling of the floor dropping out. It came a cold, vertiginous second of pure terror, the body's honest response to the burning of a bridge. She let it come, and she sat through it, And it passed the way physical pain passes when you stop fighting it, and what was left on the other side was something she hadn't expected. Clarity. The terrible, quiet clarity of a person who has just made the decision they cannot unmake. Her phone lit up immediately. The firm's HR number. She did not answer. Then Kane's direct line. She did not answer. Then a number she didn't recognize, probably a junior associate calling on Kane's instruction. She put the phone face down on the desk. She turned to Dominic. "I need a lawyer," she said. "Not for the bar exam. For this." "I know someone," he said. "Someone who isn't connected to you," she said. "I need someone whose involvement can't be characterized as an extension of your interests. If this goes to a hearing, the other side will look for every angle to discredit the documentation. One of those angles will be you." He looked at her steadily. "You've thought this through." "I've been awake since 6, she said. He almost smiled. "Not quite. I know someone independent," he said. "A woman who has no relationship with me professionally. She's in civil litigation. Give me her name," Elena said. "I'll contact her myself." He wrote a name on a piece of paper. He handed it to her. She looked at the name, Claire Sutton, Sutton and Associates. She put it in her pocket. She looked at the 4 boxes of documentation. "I need copies of everything," she said. "Full copies. I need them on an encrypted drive I control, not a server you control, not a cloud system connected to your network." "I can have that ready by this afternoon," he said. 3 o'clock, she said. "I'll come back." She picked up her coat from where she'd draped it over a chair. She put it on. She picked up her bag. She was at the door when Dominic said, "Elena." She stopped. She didn't turn immediately. "What happened last night?" he said. "The people in that room, what they said and what they did, that's not something you deserved." She stood with her hand on the door frame. "I know that," she said. And she did know it. She had always known it. The problem had never been the knowing. The problem had been living in a world that operated according to a different understanding and deciding how far you were willing to go to correct it. She pushed through the door and walked out into the Meridian District morning, and the cold hit her face and she kept walking. She had 22 days. No job. No income from the job she'd just ended. A conflict of interest proceeding that Kane would almost certainly still file, based on the meeting this morning, regardless of her resignation. A fight she had just formally entered against 2 men who had spent years protectioning around themselves while quietly erasing her name from her own work. And 4 boxes of documentation that said she might actually win. She walked 3 blocks before she stopped at a corner and pulled out her phone and called Destiny back. It rang 4 times. "Elena, I resigned," Elena said. "Effective this morning. I need you to do something." A long silence. "What?" Destiny said finally. "Your original offer letter from Kane," Elena said. "Pull it. Save a copy somewhere that isn't firm property. I need to know if the IP clause in yours matches mine." Elena. "I can't."
"I'm not asking you to do anything that violates your employment,"
Elena said. "I'm asking you to look at a document that pertains to you. Your offer letter. Your terms. That's your legal right." Another silence, longer. "Okay," Destiny said quietly. "Thank you," Elena said. She hung up. She started walking again. She thought about the Kellerman, brief, the 11 o'clock coffee shop, cold tea, the feeling she'd had when she filed the final draft, a private, complete satisfaction that she had learned to keep entirely interior, because the exterior world had made clear it wasn't interested in her satisfaction. She thought about what it would feel like to say, "I wrote that in a room full of people who had benefited from pretending she hadn't." She was going to find out. But first, before any of that, before the lawyer and the copied drives and the formal proceedings that were now inevitable, she had to find a way to survive 22 days without a paycheck, without a professional reference she could safely use, without the structure that had been organizing her life for the past 4 years. She had $340 in checking and approximately $1,100 in savings and a bar exam application that was already paid for. She stopped at the corner of Morrison and 12th. She looked at the city around her, the morning traffic, the coffee shop with its line out the door, the ordinary human machinery of a Wednesday in progress. She had burned every safe thing she had, She had the documentation. She had the name of a lawyer. She had 22 days. She pulled out her phone one more time. She called her mother. It rang twice. "Baby," her mother said in the voice that had been answering Elena's calls for 29 years, with the particular warmth of someone who picks up differently for this number than any other. Elena stood on the corner of Morrison and 12th, with the cold on her face and her hands steadier than they had any right to be, and she said, "Mama, I need to tell you what I've done, and then I need to ask you something I've never asked you before." Her mother said, "I'm listening," and the two words landed with a weight that was not a burden but a foundation, and Elena breathed in once and began. Her mother said yes. She didn't ask how much. She didn't ask for a timeline. She said yes, the way she had always said yes to the things that mattered, with a simplicity that had no performance in it, just the flat, undecorated fact of a woman who had spent her whole life making space for her daughter to become something larger than either of them could have named when Elena was small. Elena stood on the corner of Morrison and 12th and said thank you in a voice that almost held and then did hold, because she was not going to cry on a street corner on a Wednesday morning when she had 22 days and a fight to build. She went home. She spent the afternoon at her kitchen table with her study materials pushed to one side and her legal pad pulled close, and she began constructing the case the way she constructed everything methodically, from the foundation up, establishing what she had before she decided what she needed. She called Claire Sutton at 4:15. The phone rang 6 times and she was preparing herself for voicemail when a woman answered with the brisk, slightly distracted quality of someone who picks up calls between other things. "Sutton, my name is Elena Marlowe," Elena said. "I was given your name by a mutual contact. I need to consult with an attorney regarding an intellectual property dispute and a potential wrongful employment action. I have documentation, a beat, the distracted quality sharpened into something more focused." "What kind of documentation?" 4 boxes, Elena said. "Emails, internal memos, metadata records, 2 versions of an employment contract, one signed, one modified without my knowledge or signature." Another beat, longer. "Can you come in tomorrow morning?" Claire Sutton said. "Yes," Elena said. 8 o'clock, Claire said. "Don't bring the documentation yet. Just come and talk." She hung up. Elena sat with the quiet of the apartment and the legal pad and the 22 days and tried to study for 2 hours. She managed it. Not well, but she managed it. She ran through procedure and evidence and the dense architecture of professional responsibility law with the grim discipline of someone doing physical therapy on an injury that hasn't finished hurting. She slept 6 hours. She was at Claire Sutton's office at 7:55. Claire Sutton was a compact woman in her mid-50s, with close-cropped natural hair going silver at the edges, and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who are always managing more than one thing. Her office was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old carpet and good coffee, and the walls were covered in case files rather than credentials, which Elena took as a good sign. Claire listened 45 minutes without interrupting. Elena talked the way she had trained herself to talk in professional settings sequentially, without editorializing, evidence first and interpretation following. She laid out the timeline, the Kellerman brief, the reclassified contract, the investor presentations, Marcus, Kane, the phone call from Destiny, the resignation. When she finished, Claire was quiet for a moment. "The resignation was smart," she said. "Risky, but smart. Timing cuts off the conflict of interest angle if they try to formalize it." She tapped a pen against her desk. "Has Kane filed anything yet?" "Not that I've been notified of," Elena said. "But I've been ignoring his calls." "Keep ignoring them," Claire said. "Don't communicate with Kane or Marcus or anyone from the firm directly. Everything goes through me." She looked at Elena steadily. "The documentation you described, you said you have an encrypted copy?" "I'm picking it up this afternoon." "Good. Bring me a copy after you've verified the contents." She leaned back. "I want to be direct with you about something. The IP claim is strong. The unsigned contract modification is, frankly, if it's what you've described, it's a significant exposure for Kane, professionally, not just legally. We're talking potential bar complaint territory." Elena nodded. The Marcus piece is more complicated, Claire said. Because you were a paralegal working for the firm, not directly employed by Marcus. The chain of liability runs through Kane. Marcus is connected, but the direct claim against him requires the investor presentations, Elena said. He presented my analysis to investors as proprietary research developed by Voss Holdings. That's a direct appropriation, separate from the employment relationship. Claire looked at her with the particular attention of a lawyer evaluating another mind. You have those presentations documented? With timestamps, investor distribution lists, and the source memos they were drawn from, Elena said. All in the boxes. Claire said nothing for a moment. Then she said, How are you funding this? My mother, Elena said. She paused. I'll manage. Claire held her gaze. I'm going to take this on contingency, she said. Partial. A reduced hourly rate for the preliminary work, and we revisit the fee structure when we have a clearer picture of where this lands. She said it without sentiment, the way she would discuss any other procedural arrangement. I want to be clear that's not charity. If the documentation is what you say it is, this case has teeth. I take cases with teeth. Elena breathed out once. All right, she said. She left Claire's office at 9:15 and went to pick up the encrypted drives and spent the rest of that day, and most of the next 3 doing 2 things simultaneously. Studying for the bar exam and building the factual record for a case that had no name yet, but was beginning to take shape with the slow, inexorable clarity of a photograph developing in a dark room. She did not speak to Dominic Hail for 4 days. On the 5th day, he called. Kane filed, he said, without preamble, a complaint with the State Bar Association. Character review on the grounds that you improperly accessed confidential client information during your employment. She was sitting at the kitchen table. She set down her highlighter. When, this morning, my contact at the Bar Association saw it come in. A pause. Elena, this was filed 24 hours before your resignation would have been formally logged in the bar's system. They backdated the trigger point. They're claiming the conflict of interest as your resignation. She stared at the legal pad. That's not possible, she said. I resigned before. They're claiming the improper access happened 3 weeks ago, Dominic said, based on a log of system queries made from your workstation. Someone ran a search on the Kellerman billing records 3 weeks ago using your credentials. The apartment was very quiet. I didn't run that search, she said. I know, he said. Dominic. Her voice had gone flat and careful, the way it went when she was working very hard to keep something out of it. Did someone run that search on my behalf? Using my credentials without my knowledge. A silence that told her everything before he answered. I need you to be honest with me right now, she said. Completely. One of my people accessed the firm's billing system to verify the Kellerman file numbers, he said. 6 weeks ago, before I approached you, before I knew what I was going to do with the information. He paused, a standard due diligence step in how I operate. Using my login credentials, she said. Using an access pathway that ran through your workstation, he said. Which is not the same as... Stop. The word came out with more force than she intended. She breathed. Stop. Don't give me the legal distinction right now. Tell me exactly what happened, he told her. It took 7 minutes. She listened without speaking, and the picture that assembled itself in those 7 minutes was not a comfortable picture. Dominic's people had identified her workstation as having access to the Kellerman billing records. They had used a remote access method, technical, deniable, the kind of thing that leaves traces that look like user activity if you're reading the logs without forensic depth to pull the file numbers for verification. It had happened 6 weeks ago. He had not told her because it was operationally routine in his world, and he had not anticipated that it would be used against her. He had not anticipated it. She sat with that for a long moment. You used my credentials, she said, without my knowledge, to access a system, and the evidence of that access is now being used by the man we are trying to expose to file a character complaint against me with the State Bar. Yes, he said, and to his credit, he did not try to make it smaller than it was. That complaint, she said, if it's sustained, delays my bar admission. Potentially indefinitely. Everything I have built toward for 4 years. Yes. And you didn't tell me. No, he said. I didn't. She stood up from the table. She walked to the window. She stood there with her phone pressed to her ear and looked at the alley below, and felt the compound feeling from the night she'd read the contracts, the compound of grief and anger and shock, but this time with something sharper underneath it. Something that didn't have a polite name. I need to call my lawyer, she said. Elena, I need to call my lawyer, she said again. I'll call you back. She ended the call. She called Claire. Claire listened to the update in the same focused silence she gave everything. And when Elena finished, there was a pause, and then Claire said, Okay, here's where we are. The backdated complaint is procedurally aggressive, but it has a problem. What problem? Elena said. The bar's character review process requires the complaint to be supported by documentation of the alleged misconduct, Claire said. Kane will have to produce the access logs. If those logs show a forensic signature that doesn't match standard user activity, if there's any technical indication that the access was remote rather than local, we can challenge the entire evidentiary basis of the complaint. And if the logs look clean, Elena said, if his people covered their track off enough that it reads as me, then we have a harder fight, Claire said, but not an impossible one. The timing argument still holds you resigned before any formal complaint was documented as warranted, and I can argue the complaint is retaliatory in nature based on the sequence of events. She paused. I need everything you have on Dominic Hail's involvement. All of it. I need to know exactly what I'm working with. Elena told her. Claire was quiet for a moment after. His people accessing that system is a liability, she said. I won't sugarcoat it. If Kane's attorneys discover the access was connected to Hail, they'll use it to paint you as a co-conspirator in some kind of coordinated attack on the firm. I know, Elena said, which means we need to move faster than they're expecting, Claire said. I want to file the IP claim and the wrongful modification complaint this week. We go on offense before they can fully establish the defensive narrative. This week, Elena said, I have 18 days until the bar exam. I know, Claire said. Can you do both? Elena looked at the legal pad, at the highlighters, at the color-coded tabs, at the 4 years of her life, compressed into study materials that represented the only direction she had ever been moving. Yes, she said. She called Dominic back. He answered immediately. The access log, she said. Your people who ran the remote entry. Is there a forensic signature? Any technical indicator that distinguishes it from standard local user activity? Pause. I'd need to ask. Ask now, she said. I need an answer in the next 2 hours. She heard him move, heard the quality of the ambient sound around him. Shift, a door, a different room. He said something she couldn't make out to someone else. Then he came back. I'll have an answer in 40 minutes. Good, she said. And then, because she was not going to let it sit unsaid, Dominic. What you did the access without telling me, I understand why you did it in the context of how you operate. I'm not interested in processing that right now. What I'm interested in is winning. But when this is over, we are going to have a direct conversation about what it means to bring someone into a situation without giving them the full picture. A silence. Yes, he said. We are. She spent the next 40 minutes on evidence rules. Hearsay exceptions. The business records exception. The authentication requirements for electronic documents. She moved through the material with the focused aggression of someone turning anxiety into fuel because it was the only productive thing to do with it. Dominic called back in 37 minutes. The signature is clean, he said. My people used a session mirroring technique that routes through the legitimate user's active session. To a standard log reader, it's indistinguishable from the credentialed user. So the logs show me, she said. They show your session, he said. Yes, she processed that. But, he said, there's one technical indicator. The query was run at 2:47 in the afternoon, 6 weeks ago on a Tuesday. That's a work day, she said. I'd have been in the office. You were in the office, he said. I verified that. You signed in at 8:20 and your keycard shows you in the building all day. He paused. But at 2:47, specifically, you were in a client meeting. Conference room, B. The meeting log shows 7 people present, you included. The meeting ran from 2:30 to 4:15. She went very still. The access log shows me running a query, she said slowly, at a time when I was physically present in a meeting with 6 witnesses. Yes, he said. She exhaled. It wasn't clean, it wasn't simple. But it was something a crack in the fabrication, a specific, documentable impossibility that a forensic review could establish. She had been in a meeting. There were 6 other people who could confirm it. The conference room had a badge reader. The meeting had been calendared and attended and logged. I need the meeting log from that day, she said. The calendar entry, the badge reader record for conference room B, and contact information for everyone who was in that meeting. I can get the badge records, he said. The calendar entry and attendee list you'll need to get from Destiny, she said. She was in that meeting. She paused. She was in almost every meeting. She called Destiny. It rang 3 times. When Destiny answered, she was in the stairwell again. Elena could tell from the acoustics, the slight echo, the careful quiet of a person conducting a conversation they don't want overheard. The Tuesday meeting, Elena said, 6 weeks ago. The Hendricks account review. 2:30 to 4:15. Conference room B. I remember it, Destiny said. Were you there? Yes. 7 of us. A breath. Elena, what is this about? Someone ran a query from my workstation at 2:47 that afternoon, Elena said. While I was in that meeting. Silence. So it wasn't you, Destiny said. It wasn't me, Elena said. I need that meeting to be documented. I need everyone who was in that room to be reachable. I have the calendar invite, Destiny said. It's still in my calendar. All the attendees are listed. Save it, Elena said. Save it somewhere that isn't firm property. Right now. Okay, Destiny said. Okay. A pause. Elena Kane called a second meeting this morning. About you. He told us not to communicate with you. Her voice was careful and level. I'm in a stairwell. I know, Elena said. I know you are. Thank you. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen's table, and she laid out what she had. The alibi for the access log, the unsigned contract modification, the metadata records, the investor presentations, the email chain between Marcus and Kane, the original IP clause, 4 boxes of documentation. Against her, a bar complaint filed by a senior attorney with 30 years of relationships in this city. A man who knew every procedural lever and how to pull it. A man who had spent 6 weeks at minimum preparing for exactly this eventuality. She had 18 days. She went to Claire's office the next morning with the encrypted drive. Claire spent 4 hours with the materials, and when she came out of her review, she sat across from Elena with the particular expression of a lawyer who has just confirmed a thesis she was hoping was true. We file tomorrow, Claire said. Both claims? Elena said. The IP claim and the wrongful modification complaint go in simultaneously, Claire said. And we preemptively file a response to the bar complaint with the meeting alibi attached. We don't wait for them to build the narrative. We establish ours first. What's our narrative? Elena said. Claire looked at her steadily. That Marcus Voss and Richard Kane spent 4 years systematically stripping attribution from work you produced, restructured your employment contract without disclosure or consent to eliminate your legal claim to that work, and when you resigned, filed a fabricated misconduct complaint using falsified access logs to prevent you from being admitted to the bar. She paused. The narrative is the truth. We just have to say it first and say it clearly. Elena nodded. There's one more thing, Claire said. The bar complaint review. The character committee meets in 10 days. That's 8 days before your exam. She looked at Elena with the directness of someone who does not believe in softening factual information. If the committee decides to hold a formal hearing rather than dismiss the complaint, the hearing could be scheduled after your exam date, which means you sit the exam not knowing whether your results will be held pending review. I know, Elena said. That's a hard thing to sit with, Claire said. I know, Elena said again. I'm going to sit the exam anyway. The filing went in the next morning at 9:17. By noon, Kane's attorney had called Claire 3 times. By 2 o'clock, Marcus's personal attorney, a different firm, expensive and aggressive, had sent a letter characterizing the IP claim as frivolous and threatening a countersuit for defamation. By 4 o'clock, the countersuit threat had been answered by Claire with a 4-page letter that was, in Elena's professional assessment, one of the more precise pieces of legal writing she had read outside of a published opinion, and which essentially said, "File it and find out." Elena was at the kitchen table studying when her phone lit up. Not Dominic, not Claire, not Destiny, Celeste Harrington. She stared at the name for 2 full rings. Then she answered. "Ms. Marlowe." Celeste's voice was different from the voice at the engagement dinner. The performance was gone. What was left was something Elena hadn't expected, something that sounded, stripped of everything, like a woman who is tired. "Celeste," Elena said carefully. "I need to ask you something directly," Celeste said. "And I need you to be honest with me, because I don't have time for anything else right now," Elena said. "The things being said about Marcus's company," Celeste said. "The financial irregularities, the attribution to issue with the research and the briefs." A pause. "How much of it is documented?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "All of it," she said. The silence on Celeste's end had the quality of someone absorbing a confirmation they already knew was coming. "My father invited Dominic Hail to that dinner," Celeste said slowly, working through it out loud. "My father knew. He's known for how long has he known?" "I don't know the answer to that," Elena said. "He knew before the engagement," Celeste said, and her voice had the flat, hollow quality of someone hearing a door close. "He knew and he didn't tell me." Elena said nothing. It wasn't her information to add to. "Is the documentation in the hands of an attorney?" Celeste asked. "Yes." "Is it going to be used in a formal proceeding?" "Yes." Another silence. "My father's financial relationship with Marcus," Celeste said carefully. "The Harrington money that went into the Voss funds. Is that part of what's being?" "Celeste," Elena said gently. "I can't discuss the specifics of an active legal matter." "Right," Celeste said. A breath. "Right." The word came out with a weight that had nothing to do with legal procedure. "Are you all right?" Elena said. She hadn't planned to ask it. Came from somewhere instinctive. A long pause. "No," Celeste said. "But I will be." And beneath the practiced control of her voice, Elena heard something she recognized, the particular frequency of a woman who has just decided to stop performing and start assessing the damage. "Thank you for being direct with me." "I'm sorry," Elena said. "For the situation." Celeste made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You're sorry. Another almost law. You sat in that ballroom while I was cruel to you, and you're sorry for me." "I'm not sorry for what happened to me," Elena said. "I'm sorry for what's happening to you." The line was quiet for a moment. "Goodbye, Ms. Marlowe," Celeste said. "Goodbye," Elena said. She set the phone down. She sat with the silence of the apartment for a full minute. Then she picked up her highlighter. She went back to the evidence rules. 8 days until the character committee met. 15 days until the bar exam. She studied until 1 in the morning. She slept 5 hours. She got up and studied again. On the 6th day after filing, Kane's attorney called Claire with an offer. Elena sat in Claire's office and listened to it described. Kane would withdraw the bar complaint in exchange for Elena signing a non-disclosure agreement covering all materials related to her employment at the firm, a release of all claims against Kane and the firm, and a payment described in the offer, a professional courtesy settlement of $30,000. Elena looked at the number on Claire's notepad. She thought about 11 o'clock in a coffee shop. Cold tea, the Kellerman brief, the particular private satisfaction of work, well done in a room where no one was watching. She thought about the partner walking past her desk the morning after the verdict. "No," she said. Claire nodded once. "I'll communicate your position." "Tell them," Elena said, "that we'll see them at the character committee hearing, and that we'll also see them in civil court, and that the investor presentations are going to be particularly interesting in the discovery phase." Claire wrote something on her notepad. "I'll phrase it professionally," she said. "Of course," Elena said. The next morning, Kane withdrew the bar complaint. Not in response to their counter, Claire told her, or not only in response to their counter. Thomas Harrington had called Kane directly. Elena didn't know what was said in that call. She didn't need to know. The result was the same. The complaint was withdrawn, and the character review proceeding was closed. And with 9 days left before the bar exam, Elena Marlowe was clear to sit. She sat at her kitchen table that evening, with the notification in front of her, and she felt the relief move through her like the first warm day, after a long winter. Not dramatic, just real, the simple physical fact of a danger passing. She also felt something else. This civil case was still filed. The IP claim was still pending. Marcus had not responded through his attorneys with anything other than the defamation threat that Claire had answered, and that had since gone quiet. The discovery process hadn't started. The real weight of the fight, the part that would take months, possibly years, the part that would require her to stand in rooms and say, "I built this," and my name was taken off it, had not yet arrived. She was from an exam in 3 days. From the exam, at 7 in the morning, her phone rang with a number she didn't know. She almost didn't answer. She answered Ms. Marlowe, a man's voice. Measured and careful, with the specific professional neutrality of someone reading from an interior script. "My name is David Ossie. I'm the lead attorney for 3 of Marcus Voss's primary investment partners. I've been asked to reach out to you directly because there's a matter of mutual concern that my clients would like to discuss with you before the formal discovery process begins." She sat up straighter. "What matter?" she said. "My clients," he said, "have recently become aware of certain financial representations made to them by Voss Holdings that appear to be inconsistent with the actual sourcing of the research underlying those representations." A pause. "They would like to discuss the documentation in your possession." "They would like to discuss," she said. "Yes," he said. As potential co-complainants. She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Ossie," she said, "I have a bar exam in 3 days." "I'm aware," he said. "My clients are prepared to wait." "Good," she said. "Have your clients contact my attorney, Claire Sutton?" Everything goes through her. She gave him Claire's number. She ended the call. She sat at the kitchen table in the early morning quiet, and she understood in that moment what was happening. The architecture of what Marcus had built was beginning to fail from within, not because Elena had brought it down, not yet, but because the people who had trusted it were now looking at it with the specific attention that litigation focuses on a structure, and what they were seeing was not solid. The investors were not calling because of loyalty to her. They were calling because they had lost money, and they needed a plaintiff with standing and documentation. She knew that. She was going to use it anyway. She picked up her study materials. She had 3 days. She was going to walk into that exam room, and she was going to sit down, and she was going to answer every question with everything she had, and she was going to be, for those days, only a person taking an exam, not a person in a legal fight, not a person who had resigned from her job and emptied her savings and made the call that changed everything. Just a person with a number 2 pencil and 4 years of study materials and the particular ferocious discipline of someone who has never had the luxury of giving up. She opened the evidence textbook. She turned to hearsay. She began. And in a building across the city, in a corner office on the 14th floor, Richard Kane stood at his window and looked at the city he had navigated for 30 years, and held his phone in his hand and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific and clarifying sensation of a man who is running out of. Richard Kane ran out of time on a Thursday, not dramatically, not with the sudden violence of a door kicked in or a phone call that changed everything in a single sentence. He ran out of time the way most things end when they have been ending for a long time quietly, incrementally, and then all at once. The way a wall that has been taking water for years finally yields not in a storm, but on an ordinary afternoon, when the weight simply becomes more than the structure can hold. Call came from his own malpractice carrier. They had been notified of the civil filing. They had reviewed the documentation Claire Sutton had attached to the complaint, the unsigned contract modification, the email chain, the metadata records. The carrier's representative said, in a careful and professionally neutral voice, conducting an internal review of the firm's exposure. In the meantime, they were recommending that Kane retain independent counsel, separate from the firm's existing representation. Cain stood at his window for a long time after that call ended. He had built the firm over 30 years. He had taken on partners and shed them, had navigated recessions and regulatory shifts, and the particular human attrition of a profession that consumed people steadily. And he had survived all of it through a combination of genuine skill and the kind of relationships that are built not on affection, but on mutual utility. He had been useful to powerful people. They had been useful to him. The arrangement worked. He looked at the city below his window and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has spent 30 years reading situations, that the arrangement was over. He called his personal attorney. He did not call Marcus Voss. Elena did not know any of this on the morning she walked into the bar exam. She knew the exam room. She had visualized it enough times that the actual physical reality of it, the long tables, the plastic chairs, the particular institutional smell of a large testing space, felt more like a memory than a new experience. She found her assigned seat. She sat down. She put her pencils on the table. She folded her hands in her lap. Around her, people rustled and shifted with the nervous energy of hundreds of people simultaneously managing the same fear. She felt it too, not the paralyzing kind, but the productive kind, the kind that sharpens the edges of things. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and she ran through nothing in particular, just let her mind rest in the quiet before the start. She thought about the coffee shop, the cold tea, 11 o'clock on a Wednesday, thought about the engagement dinner, the green dress. The moment the doors opened and the room went quiet, she thought about her mother's voice on the phone. "I'm listening." The proctor said begin. She opened the booklet. The questions were in English. All of them. She almost laughed. She wrote for 6 hours the first day and 6 hours the second. And when she walked out of the testing center on the afternoon of the second day, the sunlight hit her face with the particular force of something that has been waiting. And she stood on the steps for a moment and breathed and felt the specific, exhausted quiet of a person who has done everything they can do and now has to wait for the world to catch up. Her phone had 14 messages. She didn't read them on the steps. She walked to the coffee shop 3 blocks from the testing center, not the one from the Kellerman brief, a different one, but close enough in character that it felt right, and she sat down and ordered a tea and let it get warm before she read anything. Claire had sent 4 messages. The summary of them was, 3 of Marcus's investors had formally joined the civil complaint as co-plaintiffs. The complaint now represented a combined claim that Claire estimated, conservatively, at a number Elena did not let herself dwell on, because dwelling on it would require believing it was real. And she had learned to move through this process, one verified fact at a time. Dominic had sent one message. It said, "How did it go?" She looked at that message for a moment. Then she replied, "Done." Waiting. He replied within 30 seconds. "Come to dinner." Not an event. Just dinner. She looked at the message. She typed, "Not tonight." Then she looked at that and typed, "Ask me again next week." Put the phone down and drank her tea. The results took 6 weeks. She knew they would take 6 weeks. She had prepared herself for 6 weeks. She had lined up temporary work through a contact of Claire's document review for a small firm. The kind of work that is invisible and precise and exactly suited to someone who needs income and mental occupation, without the political weight of a full position. She worked and she waited, and she tried to exist in the present tense of her life, rather than the conditional future that had been consuming her for months. In those 6 weeks, the civil case moved with a speed that surprised her, even though Claire had predicted it. 3 co-plaintiffs with significant financial claims changed the weight and the urgency of the proceeding. Marcus's personal attorney sent 2 more letters and filed 1 motion to dismiss, which was denied. The discovery process began. Cain, through his independent counsel, entered into preliminary settlement discussions that were separate from the Marcus, preceding a separation that his attorney made careful and explicit, which told Elena everything she needed to know about what Cain was doing. He was cutting Marcus loose. She was in Claire's office when Claire told her this, sitting across the desk with a cup of coffee she had barely touched. and she received the information with the stillness of someone who has been expecting a particular development and still needs a moment when it arrives. He's cooperating, Claire said, partially, enough to establish a separate track. His counsel has indicated he's prepared to provide documentation confirming the contract modification was done without your knowledge or consent, and that the decision originated with Voss. Blaming Marcus, Elena said. He's repositioning, Claire said, which is not the same as taking responsibility. But in terms of your case, it significantly strengthens the chain of liability. Elena looked at the wall. What does Marcus say? His attorney says he denies the characterization, Claire said. He maintains the research attribution was standard industry practice for a paralegal's work product, and that your employment contract, as modified, was disclosed to you through the firm's general policy update notification. I never received that notification, Elena said. I know, Claire said. And the IT records show the notification email was sent to a distribution list that didn't include your address. She paused. His own firm's IT records undercut his own attorney's argument. It's a remarkable achievement in self-destruction. The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning, 8 weeks after the bar exam. Elena drove to the courthouse herself. Her mother had offered to come. She had said no, not because she didn't want her there, but because there was something she needed to do with this particular morning that required her to be alone with it, at least in the hours before. She parked 3 blocks away and walked. She wore a gray suit she had bought, with part of the advance Claire had arranged from the co-plaintiff's legal fund. Nothing dramatic, nothing designed to signal anything except competence and seriousness. She wore the small gold earrings her mother had given her, because they were her good luck, and she was not too practical to have good luck. She walked into the building and through security and down the corridor to the hearing room, and she pushed open the door. The room was already populated. Claire was at the plaintiff's table, her documents arranged with the neat precision of a woman who has done this many times and trusts her preparation. Co-plaintiff's attorneys occupied a second table, 3 of them, with the particular alert still of who are about to spend the morning on a fence. Across the aisle, Marcus Voss sat at the defense table with 2 attorneys on either side of him, and the expression of a man who has spent 6 weeks being told by very expensive counsel what the next several hours were going to feel like. He looked older than he had at the engagement dinner. Not dramatically, not the kind of age that happens to people in movies, but the specific, granular aging of someone who has not been sleeping well and has been inside very difficult conversations for 2 months. He looked at her when she walked in. She looked back. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took her to cross the room to the plaintiff's table. And then she sat down and turned her attention to Claire and did not look at him again. Kane was not in the room. He was a separate proceeding, a separate track. She had not expected to see him, and she hadn't wanted to. The feeling she had about Richard Kane was not anger, not anymore. It had become something colder and more clinical, the feeling you have about a problem that is being correctly processed by the appropriate systems. She didn't need to be in a room with him for that. The hearing began. Claire presented the IP claim with the methodical, unhurried clarity of someone who knows the argument is strong and doesn't need theater to support it. She walked through the metadata records, the Kellerman brief, the timestamps, the investor presentations, and the source memos. The original employment contract and the unsigned modification, and the IT records establishing that the policy notification had never been delivered to Elena's address. Marcus's attorney objected several times. Each objection was addressed and overruled or clarified and moved past. Elena sat and listened and did not react. She had been in enough rooms in the past 8 weeks that she had finally completely mastered the specific discipline of sitting in a proceeding of sit-in that was about her without letting the room see what it was doing to her interior. It wasn't numbness. The interior was very much present. She could feel every argument as it landed, could feel the weight of each documented exchange between Marcus and Kane as it was introduced into the record, could feel the specific compound of old hurt and new resolution that had been living in her chest since the night she first read the email chain in Dominic's warehouse. She felt all of it. She showed none of it. Until Claire said, "I'd like to call Elena Marlowe to the stand." She stood. She walked to the witness chair. She sat down. She looked at the hearing officer, a woman in her 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses, and the careful, attentive expression of someone who has spent a career reading people through their testimony. "Ms. Marlowe," Claire said, "in your own words, can you describe the process by which you drafted the brief in the matter of Kellerman versus Hartwell Industries?" She described it. She described the coffee shop and the late hours and the specific legal argument she had constructed, the approach of establishing emotional premise before legal framework, the technique that Dominic had identified and that she had never had a name for because it had simply been how she thought. She described the filing. She described the morning after the verdict. "And the partner, Richard Kane, what did he say to you the morning after the Kellerman verdict?" Claire asked. "Good morning," Elena said. That was all he said. The room was quiet. "He walked past my desk," she said. He'd already received the client's congratulations by then. He said, "Good morning." He kept walking. She said it without inflection, without the tremor of old injury, just the plain, documented, witnessed fact of a thing that had happened and was now part of a formal record. Marcus's attorney cross-examined her for 40 minutes. He was skilled and thorough, and he asked the same questions in different configurations, looking for inconsistency, for defensiveness, for the crack that would let him suggest that her account was colored by personal grievance. She answered everything with the same even, precise quality she brought to every question. She did not get angry. She did not deflect. When the questions were fair, she answered them directly, and when they mischaracterized the record, she corrected the mischaracterization with specificity. He asked, "Isn't it true that you had a personal relationship with Marcus Voss that might affect your characterization of these events?" She said, "I had a personal relationship with Marcus Voss that ended 4 years before any of the professional events at issue in this proceeding. The documentation I've provided doesn't require my characterization." "Speaks for itself," he asked. "Isn't it standard practice in a law firm for a paralegal's research contributions to be credited to the supervising attorney?" She said, "Research contributions, yes. The authorship of original legal arguments and the substantive drafting of a brief that won a significant verdict is not standard attribution to a supervising attorney in the firms I've reviewed. I'd ask you to provide an example of written firm policy that supports that characterization." He did not provide one. The hearing lasted 4 hours and 20 minutes. At the end of it, the hearing officer took a 30-minute recess and returned with a preliminary finding, not a final judgment. That would come later, but a preliminary finding sufficient to establish the basis for the civil proceeding to advance. The finding was in Elena's favor. She heard it with the same stillness she had maintained for 4 hours. Claire put a hand on her arm briefly, a single, contained gesture of professional satisfaction, and then turned back to her documents, and Elena sat with the finding for a moment, and then she gathered her papers, and she stood. Marcus was standing too, across the aisle, in the middle of a quiet and clearly very difficult conversation with his lead attorney. She did not approach him. There was nothing to say to him that would mean anything now. The things that had needed to be said were in the record. They were documented and admissible, and they would stand without her voice attached to them. She walked out of the hearing room. Her mother was in the corridor. She had come anyway, of course she had. She was sitting in one of the hard wooden chairs along the wall, with her hands folded in her lap and her good coat on. And when she saw Elena come through the door, she stood up with the speed of a woman 20 years younger, and she looked at Elena's face, and she read it the way she had always read it completely, without needing to be told. "Baby," she said. Elena walked to her mother, and her mother put both arms around her, and she stood in the corridor of a courthouse in the gray suit and the gold earrings, and she let herself be held, just for a moment, just for exactly as long as she needed, which was not very long, but was real and complete. Then she straightened. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Let me take you to lunch," her mother said. "Yes," Elena said. "Somewhere good. Expensive," her mother said. Elena laughed. It came out as a full sound, unguarded, And it surprised her a little the ease of it, after so many months of keeping every expression managed and interior. They went somewhere good. The bar results came the following week on a Tuesday morning, delivered by email at 7:43. Elena was at her kitchen table with coffee, and the study materials she had not yet been able to stop keeping there out of habit. And she saw the notification come in on her phone, and she set the phone down and looked at it for a full minute before she picked it up. She passed. She sat with the number on the screen, the score, the classification, the formal language of a state board, confirming that she had met the standard, and she felt something that was not triumph. Not exactly. Triumph implied an adversary conquered, a battle won, and the feeling was quieter than that and more complete. It was more like the feeling of a structure you have been building in the dark, finally being revealed as sound, not because someone told you, but because you put weight on it and it held. She called her mother first. Her mother cried, which was the only time Elena had heard her cry in 2 years, and the sound of it cracked something open in Elena's chest that she hadn't known was closed. She called Claire. Claire said, "Good. I'll start working on the bar admission paperwork today. The civil proceeding advances next month. The results help us in the damages phase." Then she paused a pause that had warmth in it, which was not something Claire deployed often or casually. "Congratulations, Elena. You earned this the right way." "Thank you," Elena said, "for everything." She waited until the afternoon to call Dominic. She sat with that decision for a while, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to be clear with herself about what the call was before she made it. The fight was mostly over. The debt, if there had been one, was settled. Whatever came next with Dominic Hail was a choice made with clear eyes and a solid floor under her feet, not a transaction conducted in the middle of a crisis. She needed to know the difference before she dialed. She dialed. He answered on the second ring. "I passed," she said. A silence. Not the silence of someone managing their response, just the silence of someone receiving information they had been waiting to receive. "Congratulations," he said, and the word was simple and unadorned, and exactly right. "I also have something to say to you," she said. "I know," he said. "What your people did with my workstation access was wrong," she said. "Not illegal. By the specific technical reading, Claire reviewed it, but it was wrong. It put me at risk, without my knowledge, and it was done without my consent. And if the alibi hadn't existed, the bar complaint might have succeeded." "I know," he said. "I don't want you to apologize," she said. "I want you to understand that going forward, if there is a going forward between us in any capacity, I don't operate in the dark. I need the full picture, every time. No operational decisions that involve me made without my knowledge. That's not negotiable." A pause. "Understood," he said. "And accepted." She looked out the kitchen window. The alley. The narrow sky. "You asked me to dinner," she said. "A few weeks ago." "I did," he said. "I said, ask me again next week," she said. "You did," he said. "It's been more than a week." "Yes," she said. "It has." A beat of silence. "Friday," he said. "Somewhere decent." "Not an event. Somewhere I can wear what I want," she said. "Whatever you want," he said. She almost said, including the green dress, and then she didn't, because the green dress was not a joke to make, and she didn't want to make it one. The green dress was still hanging in her closet. She had looked at it the morning after the hearing, and she had thought about throwing it away or giving it to someone, and then she had thought about it differently, and she had left it where it was. Not as a wound, not as a trophy, just as a piece of cloth that had been in the room the night everything changed, and that didn't need to be more or less than that. "Friday," she said. "Send me the address." She ended the call. She sat for a while longer at the kitchen table that had been her war room, and her study hall, and her midnight crisis point, and her ordinary breakfast spot for the better part of 8 months, and she looked at the legal pad with its accumulated layers of notes, case law in blue, factual record in black, dates and names and amounts in red, and she thought about everything that had happened since a gold-embossed card had appeared under her door. She thought about the engagement dinner and the green dress and the room that had laughed. She thought about Gerald Park handing her the bread basket without a word at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night. She had sent him a note after the preliminary finding. He had replied in 2 sentences, "Well done." The Kellerman brief deserved better from the start. She had kept the note. She thought about Destiny in the stairwell, whispering with the phone, angled away from the noise of a firm that was in the process of losing its shape. Destiny had been offered a position at a competing firm 3 weeks after Kane's practice began to publicly contract. She had taken it. She had texted Elena on her last day at the old firm, getting out. "Thank you for making the thing that needed to happen." Elena had replied, "You made it happen. You were in the stairwell." She thought about Celeste Harrington, who had called once more, 2 weeks after the engagement was formally ended quietly, with a brief statement from the Harrington family's communications office that said simply that Celeste and Marcus had decided mutually not to proceed. Celeste had called to say one thing, that the cruelty at the dinner had been deliberate and had been wrong, and that she was aware no apology was sufficient, but she was making one anyway. Elena had listened. She had said, "I appreciate that." She had meant it, imperfectly and genuinely in the way you mean complicated things. She thought about Thomas Harrington, who had known about Marcus's financial practices and had invited Dominic to the dinner with the specific intention of introducing a corrective force, a fact she had confirmed, through Claire's discovery process. He had known and had chosen an indirect intervention rather than a direct one, which was the choice of a man protecting his own interests alongside his daughter's, and which she had no particular opinion about beyond filing it away as information about how power operated when it wanted to remain clean. She thought about Marcus. She thought about him carefully and without heat, the way she thought about difficult evidence, looking at it directly, not around it. Marcus Voss, in the weeks following the preliminary hearing, had begun the process of unwinding Voss holdings in the specific, grinding way that a company unwinds when the financial structure beneath it is being examined by people with subpoena power. His business partners, Jin, had withdrawn. The investors who had joined Elena's complaint were in the process of recovering a portion of their losses through the civil proceeding. His personal assets were in a dispute that was going to last years. He was not ruined. In the cinematic, total sense of the word, he had resources and connections, and the particular resilience of people who have never had to build from nothing, only to rebuild from less. He would survive in some form. She did not want his destruction. She had wanted and had achieved the documentation of the truth, the formal record of what had been done and what it had cost, and who had done it. That record existed now in the files of a state board and a civil court, and the preliminary findings of a hearing officer and the metadata of a brief that had won a significant verdict 8 years ago for a man named Kellerman who had never known the name of the person who had built his case. She was going to look up Kellerman. She thought she would do that this week, just to know what had happened to him, just to complete that particular circle in her own mind. She got up from the table. She took the legal pad to the recycling bin by the door and stood there for a moment with it in her hand. She looked at the layers of notes, the case law, and the factual record, and the dates and names and amounts. Then she put it in the bin. She was not throwing anything away. The information was in the case files, in Claire's records, in the encrypted drive she kept in the drawer beside her bed. The yellow legal pad was just paper. It had been useful, and it was done. She went to her desk. She pulled out a fresh legal pad. She wrote at the top of the first page, in the blue pen she used for case law, Elena Marlowe, attorney at law. She looked at it. She crossed out attorney at law. She wasn't admitted yet. The formal admission was 3 weeks away. She was not going to write it before it was true. She wrote instead, Elena Marlowe, bar exam passed August. She looked at that. She left it. 3 weeks later, on a morning in early autumn when the air had the clean, particular quality of a season changing, she stood in a large room with 46 other people who had passed the bar and raised her right hand and said the words that made it formal and irrevocable. Her mother was in the audience. She had come with Elena's aunt, and the two of them sat in the second row with the specific composed dignity of women who have been waiting for this particular morning for a very long time and are not going to cry during it and then both of them cried during it. Elena kept her face forward. She said the words. When it was done, when the oath was administered, and the room released into the ordinary noise of people congratulating each other, and cameras appearing, and families finding each other in the crowd, she stood for a moment in the middle of it and breathed. She was an attorney, not because anyone had decided to let her be one. Not because Marcus had been exposed, or Cain had been made accountable, or the civil proceeding had produced a finding in her favor, or Dominic Hail had walked through a ballroom door and made a room go quiet. Those things had happened, and they mattered, and she would not pretend otherwise. But this, the oath, the admission, the credential that now lived in the formal records of the state, this she had built herself, in the dark, over years, in coffee shops at 11 o'clock, and on buses with textbooks in her lap, and at kitchen tables in the middle of fights she hadn't planned to be in. Nobody had given her this. Nobody could take it. Her mother found her in the crowd and embraced her and said, in a voice that was entirely steady, "Your father would have been here." "I know," Elena said. "I know he would." They stood together for a moment, the two of them in the ordinary noise of a room full of people starting new chapters. Then her mother pulled back and looked at her daughter with the full, clear-eyed attention of a woman who knows someone completely. "What happens now?" she said. Elena looked at her. She thought about the cases that were pending, the civil proceeding that was still in its early stages, the firms she had begun quietly to speak with about positioned smaller firms, the kind that wanted attorneys who understood both the law and the shape of a real fight. She thought about the particular kind of work she wanted to do, which had come into focus for her over the past months with the clarity of something that had always been there, but had required everything that had happened to become visible. Employment law. She wanted to do employment law. She wanted to sit across from the version of herself that had existed 4 years ago in a paralegal's chair and say, "Here is what you can do. Here is what you are entitled to. Here is how the argument is built." She wanted to be the persons in the room who could put a name to what was happening to someone who didn't yet have the language for it. She wanted, in the most precise and unromantic sense of the word, to be useful. "Work," she said to her mother. "That's what happens now." Her mother smiled. It was a full smile, the kind she didn't deploy casually. "Good," she said. "Let's eat first." Elena laughed. She followed her mother out of the admission room and into the corridor, and then out through the building's main doors into the autumn morning, and the air hit her face with the clean force of a season that had just begun, and she kept walking. On Friday evening, she had dinner with Dominic Hail at a small restaurant in the Meridian district that was not an event. It was a back corner table and decent wine, and a conversation that moved between the case and the bar's exam, and the kind of ordinary things that people discuss when they are two specific people in a room rather than two roles in a crisis. She wore what she wanted. She was comfortable. At one point, during a silence that had no tension in it, he looked at her and said, "What do you want from this? From us?" Whatever this is, she considered it. Not the way she had considered things during the months of the fight with the tactical, calculating attention of someone managing risk, but the way you consider something when the emergency is over and what's left is just the real question. "I want to find out," she said, without an agenda, without it being about what came before. She met his eyes. "Can you do that?" He looked at her steadily. "I can try," he said. "I think trying honestly is more than most people manage." "It is," she said. "It's enough." Months passed. The civil proceeding reached a settlement in the spring, not a trial. In the end, but a settlement with terms that Claire described as aggressive and appropriate, and that Elena received with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has learned not to confuse the settlement amount with the value of the thing that was taken. The money was real. The number was meaningful. It was not the point. The point was the record. The point was the documented truth, living now in the formal archives of proceedings that could be cited and referenced, and that existed independent of anyone's willingness to acknowledge them. Point was that somewhere in the State Bar's records was a character complaint that had been withdrawn by the filer, and alongside it was Elena Marlowe's response. which documented in precise and admissible detail exactly why it had been filed and what it had been designed to prevent. Point was that anyone who looked could see exactly what had happened. And several people did look. In the months that followed, journalists covering a broader story about attribution practices in law firms, a law school that invited her to speak on a panel about legal ethics, a state bar committee studying the IP protections available to non-attorney legal staff. She spoke clearly. She did not sensationalize. She described what had happened the way she described everything sequentially, with the evidence attached. She was not performing survival. She was documenting it, which was different, and which she thought was more useful. One evening in late summer, almost exactly a year after the engagement dinner, she came home to find a small package outside her door. No return address. Inside, wrapped in plain paper, a bouquet of white flowers, dried now, tied with a piece of twine. And beneath them, a card in handwriting she didn't recognize, 3 words only. "You built this." She stood in her doorway, holding the flowers and the card, and she looked at them for a long time. She thought about the room at the Harrington Grand Ballroom, the chandelier, the 60 pairs of eyes, the sound of Marcus Voss's laugh carrying across a room that had the acoustics of a place designed for grand gestures. She thought about the woman who had stood in the doorway in a green dress, with her hands steady, and her chest not working correctly, and something iron and quiet in her that would not let her run. She had not become someone different. She had become more completely herself, which was the most difficult and most ordinary thing a person can do, and which the world tends to make as hard as possible, and which she had done anyway, not because she was exceptional, but because she had not been given the option of anything else. She put the flowers on the kitchen table. She went to her desk. She opened the case file she had been working on that afternoon. A young woman, 24, paralegal at a firm downtown who had come to Elena's aunt's 2 weeks ago, who had come to Elena's office 2 weeks ago, holder of her own documents, and the particular careful expression of someone who has been told too many times that what they know to be true is too small to matter. Elena had looked at the folder. She had said, "Sit down. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning." The woman had talked for an hour. Elena had listened with the full, complete attention of someone who understands, from the inside of the experience, exactly what it costs to tell the truth, in a room that has preferred a different version. When the woman finished, Elena had said, "This is what we have. This is what we can argue. This is how the case is built." She had walked her through it, without drama, without promises she couldn't keep, without the performance of confidence that substitutes for the real thing. The woman had said at the end, "Do you think we can win?" Elena had looked at her. "I think you deserve to find out," she had said. "That's what this is for." Now she opened that file at her desk in the late summer evening with the dried white flowers on the table behind her, and she picked up her pen and she began to work.